The room fell silent the moment Clara Bennett walked through the doors of the grand estate and saw another woman sitting in her chair. It was not just any chair. It was the seat she had occupied for 17 years beside her husband, through his failures, his illnesses, his sleepless nights, and the years when they had barely enough money to keep the lights on. Yet that evening, a younger woman sat there wearing an expensive cream-colored dress, smiling as though she had always belonged at the head of the family table. Clara stopped near the doorway, her fingers tightening around the small purse in her hand. Before she could say a word, an 81-year-old woman at the far end of the table slammed her silver-handled cane against the floor and shouted with a force that made every glass tremble. "Get up. If you believe that kindness, loyalty, and second chances still matter, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel." Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one carrying the greatest strength. Clara had never imagined that her marriage would end this way. She had married Jonathan Bennett when they were both young and struggling in a small town in Ohio. Jonathan had dreams of building a successful construction company, while Clara worked long shifts at a local hospital and came home exhausted to cook dinner, wash clothes, and help him with paperwork late into the night. When Jonathan's first business failed, Clara sold the gold bracelet her mother had left her so they could pay their debts. When Jonathan spent months recovering from an accident, Clara sat beside his hospital bed every night. When his company finally became successful, she never demanded expensive jewelry or luxury vacations. She only wanted the man she had married to remember the woman who had stood beside him before the money arrived. But success slowly changed Jonathan. His house became larger, his clothes became more expensive, and his circle of friends became filled with people who measured worth by bank accounts. Clara remained the same. She still visited the elderly neighbors on Sundays, still volunteered at the community food pantry, and still kept a framed photograph of Jonathan from their first year of marriage beside her bed. She believed that love was not supposed to disappear simply because life became comfortable. Then came Vanessa. Vanessa Reed was 32, confident, beautiful, and always perfectly dressed. She met Jonathan at a business conference in Chicago, and within months, she had become a constant presence in his life. At first, Jonathan told Clara that Vanessa was simply a consultant helping with the company's new luxury development project. Clara wanted to believe him. She ignored the late-night phone calls and unexplained trips. She ignored the perfume on his jacket and the way he suddenly began hiding his phone. Then one rainy evening, Clara found the truth. There was no dramatic confession, no screaming match, just a message on Jonathan's tablet that said everything. Vanessa had written that she was tired of waiting and wanted to know when Jonathan was finally going to make her his wife. Clara stared at those words until the screen blurred with tears. She confronted Jonathan that night. He did not deny the affair. Instead, he told her that their marriage had been over for years and that he had simply been too afraid to admit it. Those words hurt more than the betrayal itself. Clara realized that while she had been fighting to save a marriage, Jonathan had already been planning a life without her. The divorce proceedings were humiliating. Jonathan's lawyers insisted on protecting the company's assets. Clara received far less than she deserved, but she refused to fight for revenge. She moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment across town and began rebuilding her life from the ground up. The hardest part was not losing the mansion. It was losing the family she thought she had. Jonathan's mother had died years earlier, leaving his grandmother, Margaret Bennett, as the oldest and most respected member of the family. Margaret had always treated Clara like a granddaughter. Even during the divorce, Clara never expected Margaret to take her side. She simply disappeared from the family gatherings, believing it was better to give everyone space. But Margaret noticed. She noticed that Clara stopped attending Sunday dinners. She noticed that Jonathan stopped talking about her. She noticed that Vanessa suddenly appeared at family events wearing Clara's old favorite colors and behaving as though she had already won some invisible competition. Margaret said nothing. She watched. Months later, Jonathan announced a family celebration at the Bennett estate. He claimed it was a dinner to celebrate the company's biggest contract yet, but everyone knew the real purpose. Jonathan wanted to introduce Vanessa officially as the woman who would soon become his wife. Clara was not supposed to attend. Then Margaret called her. The elderly woman did not explain much. She simply asked Clara to come to dinner because there was something she needed to tell her. Clara almost refused. She had spent months trying to heal, and she did not want to reopen old wounds. But there was something in Margaret's voice that made her change her mind. That was how Clara ended up standing inside the Bennett mansion that evening. The house looked exactly as she remembered it, yet somehow it felt colder. Family members gathered around the long dining table. Jonathan sat near the center. Vanessa sat beside him. Clara entered quietly, expecting to be given some forgotten place near the end of the table. Instead, she noticed something that made her chest tighten. Vanessa was sitting in Clara's old seat. It was the chair Jonathan had chosen for her 17 years earlier. The chair where she had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas dinners, and the night Jonathan's company finally turned its first $1 million profit. Vanessa leaned back comfortably, as though the chair belonged to her. Jonathan looked at Clara, but instead of embarrassment, his expression carried irritation. Clara quietly stepped toward an empty chair. Before she could sit down, Margaret rose. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped her cane, but her eyes were sharp. "Get up." Everyone froze. Vanessa stared at her in disbelief. Margaret pointed directly at the chair. "That seat is not yours." Vanessa tried to laugh it off, assuming Margaret was joking. But the old woman's face remained serious. Margaret slowly walked toward the table and said that the chair was never merely furniture. It represented the person who had sat beside Jonathan when there was nothing to inherit, nothing to celebrate, and nothing to gain. She reminded everyone that Clara had helped Jonathan build his first company from a folding table in a rented garage. She revealed that when Jonathan's business was nearly bankrupt, Clara had secretly paid his overdue payroll using the only valuable possession she owned. Jonathan looked stunned. Margaret continued. She had kept every letter Clara had written to her during those difficult years. She had seen how Clara cared for Jonathan after his accident. She had watched Clara sacrifice her own dreams so he could pursue his. Then Margaret turned toward Vanessa. She did not insult her. She simply told her that nobody earns a family's respect by taking another woman's place. A seat could be stolen, a ring could be purchased, and a mansion could be inherited, but loyalty could not be bought. Vanessa's face turned red. Jonathan finally stood and told Margaret that she was being unfair. Margaret looked at him with tears in her eyes. She reminded him of the young man he used to be. The man who once promised Clara that if he ever became wealthy, he would make sure she never had to worry about anything again. Jonathan lowered his eyes. For the first time that evening, he looked ashamed. But Margaret was not finished. She told Jonathan that she had spent years watching people chase money, status, and comfort. She had learned that the most expensive mistake a person could make was throwing away someone who loved them before they had anything. Then she did something nobody expected. Margaret walked to Clara and held out her hand. She asked Clara to sit beside her. Clara began crying. Not because she wanted Jonathan back. Not because she wanted the mansion. She cried because, after months of feeling invisible, someone had finally remembered her worth. Clara sat beside Margaret, but she did not look at Jonathan. That night changed more than the seating arrangement. Jonathan's relationship with Vanessa began falling apart soon afterward. Vanessa realized that she had entered a family expecting wealth and admiration, but she had underestimated the strength of the people inside it. She eventually left. Jonathan tried to apologize to Clara. He brought flowers. He sent letters. He asked for another chance. Clara listened, but she did not rush back. She had learned something important during those lonely months. Forgiveness did not always mean returning to the place where you were hurt. Sometimes forgiveness meant releasing the anger and continuing forward. Clara began volunteering full-time at the community center. She helped women who were rebuilding their lives after divorce, financial hardship, and betrayal. She used the lessons she had learned to help others find their confidence again. Years later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. At the funeral, Clara stood beside the family. Before Margaret died, she had left Clara a small wooden box. Inside was the old photograph of Clara and Jonathan from their first year of marriage, along with a handwritten note. The note said that Clara should never confuse being abandoned with being worthless. Clara held the note against her heart and cried. Jonathan stood several feet away, tears streaming down his face. He finally understood what he had lost. But Clara had already become someone new. She no longer needed his approval. She no longer needed the Bennett mansion. She no longer needed that chair. Because she had discovered something far more valuable, her own worth. Years later, Clara opened a small community center for women starting over. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read, "You are still worthy." And in the main room stood an old wooden chair. It was the same chair from the Bennett family dining room. Margaret had left it to Clara in her will. Clara never sat in it as a symbol of revenge. She placed it near the entrance, so every woman who walked through the doors could see it. To Clara, that chair no longer represented the place she had lost. It represented the dignity she had found. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more stories about courage, kindness, and second chances. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little reminder that their lives can still change. And before we end, comment "I know my worth" if you believe that being rejected, betrayed, or abandoned does not determine your value. Because sometimes life takes away the seat you thought belonged to you forever, only to teach you that you were never meant to spend your life fighting for a chair. You were meant to build your own table.